we understand that all these organizations have a motive in not letting Ukraine become a full member, but also have an interest in not letting Ukraine completely be out because they want to make sure that the issue is always hot, the issue stays, the situation stays volatile, ताकि Russia involved रहे सारे issue में, ताकि so, it would continue to pose a threat to Russia.
Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to the 8th episode of Let's Talk Pakistan, a podcast where we discuss everything from global issues to tech updates. Today we have with us Ms. Ifrah Maskan, who is a dear friend of mine from university. Ms. Maskan works as a research associate with Nur Markaz with a keen eye for security policy and international relations. I requested her here on this podcast to come and shed some light on the ongoing Ukraine crisis. Welcome to the podcast, Ifrah.
Thank you so much, Hassan. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So before we actually begin asking Ifra about the whole crisis, I would just like to update people on some recent events that have happened today at the time of the shooting of the episode. So as of almost 1 hour ago, US President Joe Biden issued a statement that said that Russian invasion of Ukraine is now a very high risk threat and added that the door of diplomacy is still open for the Russian diplomats. Speaking at the reporters at the White House, Biden said that every indication in Washington had suggested Moscow was prepared to go into Ukraine within several days. Similarly, on the other hand, NATO Secretary General has also voiced concern that Russia may be attempting to stage a pretext for an attack on Ukraine following reports of shelling in the country's conflict hit east. The Secretary General's warning delivered at the alliance headquarters in Brussels today came amid competing claims from Russia that that there is no such thing happening over there, and and with that, I'd like Ifra to actually explain the historic context of how we got here, because this very thing is on the verge of actually escalating into a war. And Ifra, just letting people here know that we did an episode earlier on Ukraine crisis as well, where in January, where we actually discussed the whole situation, and I talked to a journalist, and we talked about how this crisis could escalate in the future. But then we were of the view that this crisis would not escalate that much because then the current incumbent government in Germany was very new, Mr. Scholloff. And similarly, we believe that the economic burden of this whole thing would be very too much for both sides to actually take on and continue with the war. But we see today that the war is a possibility, and we see that even UK yesterday announced to double its forces uh, inside US inside Ukraine. Sorry, not in US, Ukraine. But then they said that they'd only be doing some export exercises and withdrawing withdrawing the army. And so, to further elaborate on that, I'd like Ifra for you to tell us what this issue is about.
Achha, so let's get a bit of a context. Let's put this whole thing into a bit of a context, a historical perspective, so we can start. We know that Ukraine used to be a part of Russia, और फिर Cold War के बाद Russia broke down into separate states and Ukraine got separated. There's this bordering area between Russia and Ukraine, which is basically known as the Donbass region, जहाँ पे there are people who sort of have this affiliation with Russia but are legally a part of the Ukrainian territory, or they come under Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, Ukraine has sovereignty over that area, but Russia also extends claims over them. इसी तरह Crimea था, which was towards the south, और उस पे भी Russian claims थे, which and Russia eventually annexed Crimea in 2014. So we know that there are many territorial issues between these two states, जिनके भी ऊपर इनके issues चलते रहते हैं, and they have been like this for a long time. Ukraine may there are, you can say, three types of political parties, or the Ukrainian political culture is divided into three parts. there are pro-Russian people, there are completely pro-Western, pro-EU people, and then there are people who are sort of in between, who have much more focus on domestic politics and regional issues as opposed to, it's completely aligning with Russia or the West.
Exactly.
So when we talk about the current president, I think his name is Zelensky, the current
Yeah.
Ukrainian president, yeah, he's
Mm.
completely anti-Russia. So he wants to align with the West and the EU. Whereas if we go 10 years back, the president who was there from 2010 to 2014, he was completely pro-Russia. So we can say Ukrainian politics itself change hoti rehti hai, and the people themselves are divided so much that the East wants to align with Russia, whereas the West, Ukraine, wants to align with the EU and the West. And because the current political leadership wants to join the European Union and wants to be a part of NATO, तो उसकी वजह से right now Ukraine is in the middle of a crisis, जहाँ पे Russia wants to make sure that its borders do not have hostile NATO armies, whereas Ukraine wants to join the NATO to make sure that it is safe from any potential Russian invasion. Because we want to talk about this Donbass region because Russia कहता है कि we should have more control over it, and because Ukraine की territorial security is the threat in area, Ukraine thinks that joining NATO would give it some sort of or some semblance of security from any potential Russian invasion. But we all see how that is being unfolded because if there is any chance of Ukraine joining NATO, the Russia would automatically, want to go on the offensive because naturally its borders are being threatened.
Yes.
So this is
Exactly.
a bit of a context जिसमें हम यूक्रेन को place कर रहे हैं. There's a constantly changing political environment. Some people want to join the EU, some want to join Russia. But right now, the major wave within Ukraine is pro-West or pro-EU. And these are the people who have sort of taken over, especially in Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine. और हम तो ये देख रहे हैं कि their president is telling Russia, like openly telling them that, we're not afraid of an invasion, we'll give you a full-blown response if you try to invade Ukraine. And we saw that how they've already faced a situation जहाँ पे रशिया ने थोड़ा सा उनकी टेरिटरी को एनेक्स करने की कोशिश की थी क्राइमिया, which according to Russia happened through a referendum. But let's not get into that because we all know how referendums
Yeah.
can be manipulated and how they have been manipulated in the past. But right now, it's interesting to see the role that the US is playing here because, like, on the map, US is far from Russia and Ukraine. So this region does not technically come under the US. But of course, US has its influence across the country, across the world. So naturally, US wants to make sure that any element that can suppress Russia or China, US would be standing by that country, be it India or any other power, that can sort of act as a countering force in the region. तो हम इस तरह से इस पूरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में इसको प्लेस कर रहे हैं दिस यूक्रेन रशिया क्राइसिस which started off as an issue between two countries on border because it's their border, it's their security that is being threatened, but how it has now involved the entire world in the midst of it because these two major cold war wali powers are now sort of having a standoff, US and Russia, with Ukraine acting as a pawn West's pawn.
So, yeah, exactly. You're very right when you talk about NATO as being the very center of this whole issue. As of today, Zelensky actually said that Ukraine's best, as you yourself said, is joining NATO. So they said that it is not about a political ambition or joining the alliance as a part of uh, any ambition for the country, but rather they say it's a part of their survival, right? आज जो Ukrainian Ukrainian leader ने जो statement दिया, he said that we've lost 15,000 people. It's about our life and it's about the future of our people. So वो basically NATO को they're actually the current leader of Ukraine is actually comparing that to the independence of Ukraine. Okay? So that is what it's about for them, right? So that is the picture that is being painted on one side. On the other hand, there is Russia, right? Russia is saying that all that they're doing on the borders is that they're having these exercises with Belarus, right? And they're saying that once these exercises are completed by 20th of February, so they'll be leaving the area. On the other hand, what this Western media has been claiming, in fact, as of I'm just reading this update, which says that uh, Russia has actually expelled US envoy. US envoy. Wait a second. So basically, this yeah. So the DCM, which is the Deputy Chief of Mission, has been expelled from Russia. So we don't know what sort of action this is going to provoke because this is just latest news. But this shows that the issue is clearly still escalating. Or on the other hand, we had Russian foreign minister and Russian spokesperson, government spokesperson, who came on television today and he said that they have actually drafted a list of demands from US. So they said that their only steadfast demand is that the US should not allow Ukraine to join the NATO, right? So they say that as long as that demand is met, we're actually okay with moving forward with the negotiation process. तो ये तो एक चीज हो गई कि वो नेगोशिएशन प्रोसेस लाइक काफी दुनिया के जो अभी इस वक्त एनालिस्ट हैं वो कह रहे हैं कि ये जो दोनों तरफ से आई क्योंकि यूक्रेन ने भी हिंट दिया है कि हम फॉरेन ज्वाइन नहीं कर रहे कर रहे नेटो ठीक है उन्होंने जो
Yeah.
अपनी जो टोन थी उसको थोड़ा सा डायल डाउन किया ठीक है बट मेरा अब इस पे सवाल ये है कि दो इसमें चीजें हैं ठीक है एक तो ये कि व्हेन यू टॉक अबाउट रशिया ठीक है जर्मनी हैज ऑलवेज बीन द गो टू जर्मनी इज वन कंट्री दैट इज लाइक इन द सेंटर ऑफ दिस होल इशू ठीक है और इवन जो बातें हो रही हैं फॉर एग्जांपल नॉर्थ स्ट्रीम की 2 की बात हो रही है ठीक है which is supposed to double US Russian gas supply to Europe right and this pipeline is actually going to bypass Ukraine, and it's going to go to Baltic Sea. So, according to some international organizations and some who are actually favoring Russian bloc, they're saying that this actually is a response from Ukraine because currently अगर Nord Stream जो one है Nord Stream simple Nord Stream जो है uh, it 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 also bypasses Ukraine. So if there is no Nord Stream, the gas has to pass through Ukraine. Okay, so that gives Ukraine an edge over Russia because Russia has a lot of their economy dependent on gas supply to Europe, right? So आप हमें थोड़ा सा इकोनॉमिक इसमें बताएं कि इसका जो पूरा है फॉर एग्जाम्पल बिकॉज वी सी दिस एस्केलेटिंग इसका इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस और इकोनॉमिक्स पे क्या इम्पैक्ट आएगा इन द लॉन्ग रन
So interestingly, in fact, ironically, a few days ago, in fact, right at the end of January, Zelensky himself told the West not to create panic because Russian stock market was having direct impact, was being directly impacted by all these tensions that were being created by the West, especially the US. So the statements they said that on February 16th we can see a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of 16 गुजरे भी एक दिन हो गया. There was no invasion. Russian
एग्जैक्टली
accounts are itself, the Russian government accounts are tweeting कि हमने कोई invasion नहीं की, we're rolling back our forces. So of course conflicting reports आ रही हैं. Russia is saying that we're going back. EU and Ukraine and maybe the US sources are saying that Russia is still on the borders. So Ukrainian market itself is being impacted by this. एक तो ये major issue है. Second, Germany has always tried to play a more neutral role. जब हम Crimean annexation की बात कर रहे थे, तब भी Germany was the one that was trying to be more of a mediator between the two. Because अगर Crimean Peninsula पे जो भी crisis होता था, German gas supply directly उससे affect होती थी. And we know that Russia is the major supplier of this gas in this region. So EU countries are only left with two options अगर उनके पास Russian gas नहीं रहती. They could either get LNG from US or Qatar. And Qatar said that we cannot meet any shortage of gas in the region because we cannot give infinite amount of infinite supply of gas
एग्जैक्टली
to European Union. So naturally, end pay their only main source of supply is Russia. So
एग्जैक्टली
sensible countries like Germany that completely depend on their economy, they cannot take the risk of being in Russia's bad books or trying to escalate a situation this may could eventually turn into a war. Just because the entire European Union will be threatened, the European continent will be threatened. So we understand that Russia is holding a lot of cards in its hands because of this, because of being a major exporter of gas. अब Nord Stream 2 की बात तो EU ने कहा है कि if there's a war then Nord Stream 2 will not go ahead. I mean, of course, naturally अगर जंग होगी तो नहीं जाएगी आगे gas supply. The continent itself will be completely, destructed or something. But we don't think that this is going to happen because Ukraine itself is sensible economically. Ukraine understands कि किसी भी तरह की any escalation that will turn into a war or any large scale conflict is directly going to impact these two countries. और Russia से ज़्यादा Ukraine की ही economy affect होगी because Russia is a huge country. It has many other resources. It has many other ways to stabilize its economy or support its economy, but Ukraine does not. And it's also funny because if you think about it, why is it so that NATO still has not
Exactly.
accepted Ukraine as a member? And we see because of Article 5, because Article 5 states that if one NATO country is threatened, the entire NATO members or the entire NATO membership will join hands and protect that country. But for a country like Ukraine that regularly has issues or skirmishes with Russia, so kitni dafa NATO intervene karegi? So
Exactly.
it's funny, but I think that the US is trying to just sort of ignite the situation because it's about Russia, or when things are about China, तो automatically सारे वो लोग बुरे बन जाते हैं, and whichever country is on the other hand, US naturally उसको support करता है. But I honestly don't think that NATO is ever going to take Ukraine into its fold because then NATO will have to intervene in every conflict, and they just cannot afford that. They literally just got out of Afghan war, इससे पहले Iraq war. You कितनी तो wars already लड़ चुके हैं because of its members. So this whole thing just seems something that is completely being blown out of proportion just because one country wants to maintain its superiority over the other.
Yeah, it is very interesting because the economic aspect है ना Nord Stream का ये बड़ा interesting है because जिस तरह आपने कहा कि US wants to have this ascendancy over Russia, it
Hmm.
still continues to want to have some control over how things are run in Russia, and they want to have this very idea कि अगर or we've known this is a very well known fact कि US has actively tried to basically stop this Nord Stream 2 from happening, right? Because even President Biden, who's the incumbent president of the US, he's said that the statement says that he'll bring it to stop. Okay? But on the other hand, if not Nord Stream, which is already built, Russia has spent a whopping $11 billion on building this pipeline. And if it is actually turned functional, so this would actually end US's control over Russian gas supply in Europe, because what will happen is that because it's bypassing Ukraine, so that very leverage that Ukraine has right now and NATO has by extension of cutting off this gas supply from Russia to Europe, that will end, right? So and by that that means that NATO loses some of its control in Europe, and it is very interesting because जो हमने लास्ट टाइम भी यूक्रेन पे डिस्कशन की थी उस पे हारिस भाई ने he explained it very well how this whole region it is boxed in, and Russia is trying a way out, or जो if Ukraine gets under NATO as well, this means a permanent blockade for Russia from all sides, right? So on the other hand, if Russia actually succeeds, जो कि basically Nord Stream 2 बन गई है, but Germany has yet to approve it, right? तो अगर
Yeah.
अगर Germany approve कर देता है, ठीक है, that would be a game changer for US oil, US gas as well, because US की gas जो यूरोप को आती है, it is way more expensive than the Russian offers, right? और second बात ये है कि यूरोप के पास इस टाइम, although NATO is trying its best to actually speed up the process, Europe does not have a lot of storage reservoirs, ठीक है, for gas. So this actually creates problems. और जहां तक आपने कहा कि escalate नहीं होगा, so I agree because अभी भी winters चल रही हैं, ठीक है, और they need this gas to survive. So yeah, you're right over there कि वो
Also,
अभी yeah, go on.
it's funny how the US is saying that they will bring it to a stop because what means do they have? क्या वो the sanctions लगा देंगे, and then sanctions are naturally going to hurt EU countries too. So all in all, whatever US does to bring this gas supply or this gas pipeline to a stop, it's going to hurt the EU in return, and that the US cannot afford because EU and US are partners. So naturally, they're gonna have to sort of swallow this pill, and gonna have to let Russia go ahead with this gas pipeline, चाहे वो यूक्रेन को bypass करके जाए, Baltic से जाए, but eventually it's gonna happen because this is how Russia is gonna maintain its superiority in the region. US is just gonna have to deal with it.
Yeah, and also it is very interesting because when we talk about Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine are one of two world's biggest wheat exporters. ठीक है और Russian और Ukrainian wheat जो है it is bought by almost all the entire world. ठीक है और uh, no, not exactly European countries, but a lot of it goes to MENA region. ठीक है Middle East, North Africa में it's all Russian and uh, Ukrainian wheat that's been sold over there. So मेरा अब मैं अब थोड़ा सा ना इसको लेके जाना चाह रहा हूँ आईआर के उसमें ठीक है तो अब इसके अंदर मेरा ये है कि what do you see how do you see this situation actually unfolding in the future कि आपको क्या लग रहा है कि किस तरह ये रिलेशनशिप आगे बढ़ेगा because we've seen December से तकरीबन November December से this issue started and a lot of security analysts have been saying कि यार this won't escalate any further और इवन जनवरी में जो मेरी बात हुई थी जो गेस्ट आए थे इवन ही सेड के he does not see it escalating but against all the odds even today issue keeps on escalating जिस तरह मैंने लेटेस्ट अपडेट्स बताया तो आप बताएं अब आप क्या देख रही हैं
I also don't think that it will escalate to a point जहाँ पे कोई full-fledged war हो, because we all understand that these countries, Ukraine does not have nukes, but Russia does have nukes, and so does the US. And it's funny how Ukraine gave up its nukes because they sort of had an agreement with Russia that, you will not invade our borders, and we saw how that unfolded. Russia went ahead and took away Crimea. So, never make such promises and give up your weapons. But I still don't. It's also interesting to note that most of the countries around the world understand how Russia is actually threatened by the presence of NATO. And even countries like India have not supported Ukraine in this issue. Every country understands that NATO is already present around Russia. इतने सारे borders पे तो मौजूद है. They are there in Eastern Europe. They have bases around the world. So US effectively has control of this region. So we do understand why Russia is feeling threatened. But I don't think that this will turn into a full-fledged war. I feel that sense will prevail. Ukrainian president himself has been giving statements telling the US not to make this a big issue. Ukrainian market itself understands how this is going to affect them. Ukrainian population itself is divided into parts where people are supporting Russia. So when a major chunk of your population does not want a war, when people themselves are telling you to give up this idea of joining NATO for the moment, and we think that this is what's going to happen eventually. Even if Ukraine wants to join NATO, NATO itself will not take Ukraine in just because of what we discussed right now, a while ago, because of the collective security clause.
yeah
And the MENA region and all these countries will. Turkey itself has offered to be a mediator between the two. We see how these countries are trying to play some role in de-escalating the situation. So from IR perspective, I don't think that there is going to be any outright support for either party, except for the US or a few EU countries that have it in their favor, in their interest to support Ukraine because of obvious reasons. But there's no evidence of how dominant powers of the world other than Russia and US are taking sides in this whole fiasco. So it's probably just going to de-escalate in a while because all these countries understand the stakes are high. We cannot afford another war. Anything that starts now will turn into a World War III. The world also cannot afford a Cold War, जहाँ पे these countries would make their blocks and sort of block not talk to each other or not have trade with each other because of how interconnected the world is right now. It's important for them to interact with each other. And even countries like Pakistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all these are joined with Russia with another pipeline. So it's all in our interest to make sure that something like this does not spread to on such a level jahan pe it would be very hard for people to go back, to sort of go back to a point jahan pe koi jang na ho. So it's important to um, it's important to
yeah
sort of de-escalate the situation, right?
yeah
So yeah.
I understand that but on the other hand हो ये रहा है कि Russia has been like telling the world again and again, okay, we are not this, not doing this, okay?
mm,
And it is very interesting because when UN, basically how this all came to the front was US and Russian envoys actually met at the closed door meeting at some UN conference uh, at the end of January, I believe. So what happened was that after the meeting, this meeting went hot, okay, and there was a lot of sparring between two envoys. So when in a post meeting briefing, the Russian envoy said that the the Western bloc has been drumming up this whole excuse that Russia is going to invade, right? So so and he even went on to say that they're drumming this up as a way to provoke war. Okay? So even today, Russian not today, 2 days ago, Putin came out and said that Nord Stream 2 is not a geopolitical warfare subject, because I believe Ukrainian, sorry, not Russian, Ukrainian leadership has been playing a very negative role in all of this, because the Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky has been drumming up this whole thing that he's turning everything into war. Even speaking to BBC, I guess 2 days ago, he claimed on 15th February, he claimed that Nord Stream 2 was a geopolitical uh, weapon, and it is going to be used against Ukraine. Okay? Similarly, Russia claims that there are exercises going on. On the other hand, Ukraine is saying that clearly there is shelling going on, and Ukrainian rebel groups are being fully supported by uh,
Russians, yeah.
the Russian forces, right? So what do you think is the outcome of this Western propaganda and these drums that are being beaten by the Western media for very long now? So, what is the end goal in your opinion?
For starters, as an individual, I never trust Western sources completely. Whenever I feel there's something that only the US is propagating, or only, these Western countries that have vested interest in this region, whenever these are the only news sources that we find, you just should, there should be a bulb in your head that goes on. It's like, you just should not believe them. But Zelensky himself, as you talked about him, we see that while he has been touring the country and motivating the forces and telling Russia that in case of an invasion we're fully ready to respond,
Yeah,
he also understands that his forces cannot put up a fight for very long. Secondly, people in Ukraine themselves don't want a war. So as a politician, Zelensky understands that if he goes for, or he keeps propagating for a war, then eventually he's going to lose support, because nobody wants war in this region even. Thirdly, what did you just talk about? Nord Stream, and before that, क्या बात था? I was going to respond to something. What else did you
I
say
don't.
about Nord Stream?
I believe I talked about Nord Stream too. Nord Stream,
Yeah, yeah,
Uk-
war. Yeah. Just a few
media.
days ago, just a few days ago, I was reading an article which was literally sponsored by Lockheed Martin, which is a weapons producer. So it tells you how it is in the interest of these companies to project Russia as a villain, or Russia as a devil that is going, that deserves to be trashed by the US or the West, because it's their in business interests that are directly in the line, or like on the line, which is why all these people want the masses to think that situation is really bad, that there should be a war, that we need to sort of put an end to this Russian brutality. But yes, moving on to the rebels thing. Yes, that was what I wanted to talk about. So the Donbass region that we discussed right at the start, the part which Russia has some claims over, and the part that Ukraine also has claims over. वहाँ पे, if you read a bit about it, Russia has been supporting elections in that region. So
Yes.
Russian government says that as a result of successive resolutions that they've had, let's have elections over there and let the people decide. But Ukrainian government understands that the majority of the major, the large number of people in that region is Russian. So naturally, those people are going to support Russia in case of an election. and the Russian government says, and I believe the resolution says something like Russian Ukrainian forces having to Ukrainian government having to pull back its forces, and then there will be a referendum with a third party, something like that. And there's an air of mistrust between the two. So Ukraine doesn't believe Russia to not take over once Ukraine pulls its forces back. Just how we have the situation between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. There's an air of mistrust between the two, which is why the resolution cannot be implemented. So then
Exactly.
Russia itself is saying that let's have elections in the Donbass region, which means Russia is giving democracy a chance. So the US does not have a reason to intervene or push Ukraine on this issue because the US itself stands for democracy. So if your arch rival or your enemy is asking for elections, then you basically don't have a leg to stand on. So what your rebels hain, they also want elections. They also want, to be given a right to self-determination. So wahan pe Ukraine cannot have West ki support, or there's basically no rationale for them to support the Ukrainian government because they're essentially stopping a process of peaceful transition of power. So when we look at it from the Russian lens, we see that okay, Russia wants peace in that region. It is Ukraine that is not giving peace a chance. So it is the West that is not allowing for that peace to happen. So जो rebels हैं वहाँ पे, these are the people who just want to join Russia. Let them have a referendum, let them decide, and then you might not even have this volatile situation in that region. So अगर हम उस Russian lens से देखें, फिर हम कहते हैं कि वहाँ पे तो मसला ही खत्म हो जाएगा सारा. But it's these two countries that are not willing to sit on the table, or it is the West that is not letting them reach a conclusion on that point, because then फिर US की power क्या रहेगी यूक्रेन के ऊपर? Right now we see how US and EU are constantly supporting Ukraine and how Ukraine is supporting them. It's everything is happening simply in opposition to Russia, right?
Yeah, so basically, what you're saying is very interesting because there is this thing that Putin has been saying for a lot of time, a long time now, right? So he's been clearly very vocal about this idea that U.S. and Russia, Soviet Union at the sorry, U.S. and Russia at the end of Cold War did a pact where West actually promised that NATO would not further expand eastward, right? So
Exactly.
he says he says that NATO is going against that very pact, right? Or and he says that once Ukraine is actually annexed or comes under NATO's control, or in other words, becomes a part of NATO, that would be a defeat, and going back on the promises of peace that were made in the post-Cold War era. So I believe that I believe the Russian government and Russian leadership is very right on its own because we believe that it has been expanding eastward. On the other hand, we see that NATO claims that the Russian army and Russian forces have been expanding westward into Ukraine and otherwise that. So they see Nord Stream 2 as an extension of this very Russian expansion that they're talking about. Okay? So the very clash that they have today over there actually goes back to this very idea that both countries see each other as expansionists. But
Exactly.
over time, there have been a lot of diplomatic conferences between two countries. NATO has been. We both know that Russia a long time ago, I guess a year, almost like 5 to 6 months ago, had expelled NATO from Russian embassies. Sorry, from Moscow, and they said that now the Russian embassies, NATO would not be allowed to continue any diplomatic negotiation between two bodies unless and until the promises of not putting no they actually use the word putting a permanent ban on Ukraine from entering NATO. So मेरा आप इससे ये सवाल है कि when you see this whole expansionist arguments being made from both sides against each other, so how do you see कि क्या ये arguments कभी खत्म होंगे? Because at the end of the day, when we see it through a realist lens, ठीक है, expansion seems like something NATO would continue to do, but how do you see this happening? Because I don't think NATO is backing down anytime soon.
I don't think NATO is backing down anytime soon either, but I also don't think that Russia is backing down anytime soon because NATO poses a substantial threat to Russia. Russia believes that if NATO is going to be present at its borders and it's constantly going to be under scrutiny, their satellites are going to be there, US keeps asking for bases from countries like Pakistan, जिसके साथ कोई NATO का, which is not even a member of NATO. It means that US wants to continue to increase its presence in the region, to keep an eye on Russia, to continue to limit its movement in the region, to make sure that Russia does not expand economically, financially, politically, diplomatically in any way, because it directly poses a threat to the US. And when US already is dealing with another enemy like China, then it wants to make sure that it does not have a two-front war to fight with or to deal with. So of course, US is going to continue to back Ukraine. Ukraine might continue to want to join NATO, and Russia is obviously going to want to stop that. But at the same time, we also just a few days ago, I was reading something up, and I found it was funny how the EU has not given Ukraine a membership up till now. EU has not allowed Turkey to be a member up till now, because we know that once it happens, these people would want to move into other EU countries because of freedom of movement. And we also see how NATO has not allowed Ukraine to join, but is also continuing to fan the fire to make sure that Russia stays at a back foot. We understand that all these organizations have a motive in not letting Ukraine become a full member, but also have an interest in not letting Ukraine completely be out, because they want to make sure that the issue is always hot, the situation stays volatile, ताकि Russia involved रहे सारे issue में, ताकि so it would continue to pose a threat to Russia, and at the same time they would also keep Ukraine in their control, because that is how they manage to keep Russia in check. So of course, Ukraine would want to join NATO, Ukraine would want to join EU, but I also think that both these organizations will not let Ukraine be a member, because then they will also have to make certain concessions to this country. They would also have to make to allow them certain leverages too. And it's not in their interest to do so, but they also want to keep Ukraine under their control to make sure that they have uh, some sort of check over Russia. So of course, as far as I can see, this is how it's going to be. Maybe ये crisis थोड़ी देर बाद de-escalate इस तरह हो जाए that Ukraine might think, okay, maybe this is not the right time to join NATO. They might give up their demand for the time being, but उसके बाद भी हो सकता है दोबारा Ukraine demand करने लग जाए. Also because the political leadership in Ukraine is on different ends of the spectrum. So tomorrow someone might come who would think that it's much more in our interest to be aligned to Russia, because Russia is our next door neighbor. There are people who have ethnic and cultural similarities with Russia. So maybe, let's join the Russian bloc instead of the Western bloc. So of course anything can happen. But for now, if sense prevails, Ukraine should give up the demand to join NATO, at least right now.
Yeah, but when you say thing, it actually brings me to a very interesting point which I read in an article 2 to 3 days ago in anticipation of this very podcast. So the article read that Ukraine has this embedded into their some sort of article which was a part of their independence, where it actually written that entering NATO is a sort of a goal for them, right? On the other hand, um, Russia believes, we've read articles and there have been public speeches by Putin, who said that he believes that Ukraine is spiritually and culturally a part of Russia, right? So there's that as well. But let's leave that for a moment, because we believe that this, as this crisis evolves, situation will tell us where the camel will sit, right? कि ऊंट किस करवट बैठेगा. But मेरा अब इससे सवाल ना थोड़ा सा broader than US and Russia हो जाता है, because we see a lot of tensions being built between US and China as well, right? At the moment, ठीक है? US and China are going through the similar phase जहाँ पे US has been doing this thing, or we had this Kazakhstan issue not a while back, where actually it was something that escalated very fast as well, right? But Putin played very smart over there when he called back the whole alliance from Kazakhstan, and he played it very smart with Kazakhstan, right? But on the other hand, we have this issue because over there we saw that US was very fast to get offensive against Russia, right? And we see that in recent times, US has been very fast and very much radically against China as well. So do you believe that in your analysis of international relations that a bloc formation has been going on? Because even in this Ukraine crisis, China has come forward and supported Russia fully, right? And they've said nothing about Ukraine. They just said that Russia's military and security concerns are genuine, legitimate, and they must be addressed accordingly. So that is somewhat of
Agreed.
what China said. Yeah. So मेरा सवाल ये है कि how do you see this whole thing processing where there is a block, there is a US block, and there is a Chinese block, and I see कि जो European Union है, it is stuck in between. ठीक है? There is this economic
Exactly.
benefit
Yeah.
that EU gains from China, Russia, and that Eastern Bloc, right? On the other hand, we have US, which actually supplies military and which has a lot of military power in the region, or military control boards are there. We saw last year that Germany may there was this whole debate about how NATO is something that can be debated, right? ठीक है? Although the new government, it actually is a little bit pro NATO compared to the last one. I believe so. It might be wrong. I might be wrong. But मेरा ये सवाल है कि अब जब आया कि हम देख रहे हैं कि काफी अरसे से हम देख रहे हैं ब्लॉक फॉर्मेशन हो रही हैं, तो क्या आया ये जो एक थोड़ा इवेंट है, will it push these block formations even more further?
So this has the potential to turn into a cold war, of course, like we discussed earlier. To फिर तो naturally blocks बन जाते हैं, where one side supports Russia, one side supports Ukraine, and then countries, the entire world is divided into two halves. But personally, I think the amount of interconnectivity between countries that exists right now, I don't think that this very crisis will lead to an even bigger block formation, because एक थोड़ी सी um, you know block formation of sorts already exist करती है, where countries like Pakistan are in Chinese camps, countries like India are in anti-China camps. It mostly has to do with China as opposed to Russia, if you see, because countries that hate China are also friends with Russia, and countries that hate US are also, or friends with China, that sort of stuff. Where China is the one that is that is enabling these, or that is sort of marking how these blocks are formed, and not Russia. You know what I'm trying to say? That it's this regional hegemony that is sort of dividing these countries into blocks, and not this particular Russia-Ukraine crisis. Secondly, I don't think that their countries will outrightly be a part of Russia or Ukraine because of the EU crisis or the EU gas issue that we just talked about, because EU cannot afford to completely demonize Russia or completely support Ukraine, because their economic interests are at stake. But when we talk about NATO, we've seen how many European Union countries are not um, giving or not contributing to NATO the way they're supposed to. And this is what Trump also raised, this issue, that Trump said that it's the US that is sort of bearing the brunt of this entire NATO expense, or this, the US has unjustly taken the responsibility of making sure that NATO continues to prosper, because other countries are not contributing the way they're supposed to. I think it's 2% of their GDP that you're supposed to give to NATO every year, but countries are not doing that. So naturally, वो सारा burden US के ऊपर आ रहा था. So Trump himself tried to limit NATO movement, to try to limit NATO के जो पूरा role था in the
Yes.
region. And this is what France has also been saying. France itself has not been taking proper sides in this whole Ukraine-Russia issue. France is sort of also trying to act as a mediator. So we see that within European Union, there are important EU countries that are not taking sides. So I don't think उस तरह के block formation होगी जैसे हम Cold War के time पे देखते थे, straight up Russian block, straight up US block. I feel that in this case, most of the countries would try to act as mediators, because उनके stakes दोनों sides पे हैं. So you cannot just completely cut off your ties with the US and be friends with Russia. You cannot completely cut off your ties with Russia and be friends with the US. If you take the example of India, India just got S-400 from Russia, which means India की major military interest है रशिया के साथ alliance करने में, but India is also a member of Quad and many other alliances with the US. India wants to make sure कि Indian sea में US के साथ India की बनी रहे against China. So we see that countries have multiple interests. So they cannot simply decide कि अच्छा because एक border crisis चल रहा है between Russia and Ukraine, let's just join the Russian bloc or let's just join the US or Ukrainian bloc. So I feel that नहीं उस तरह की Cold War type की bloc formation नहीं होगी because the interests are much more diverse now. Countries have to look out for themselves first before any other element because all of them are realists at the end of the day. चाहे वो जितने मर्जी liberalism का lecture झाड़, so even the US itself is a big realist. So naturally bloc formation उस तरह की मेरे ख्याल में नहीं होगी.
But very interesting because अब आखिरी जो मेरा है, before we actually get to closing the topic, it is closer to home, right? When we talk about, you talk about how India has interest, has its feet both in USA ship and Russian ship as well. Similarly, this whole escalation has a very broad impact when you talk about Arabian Peninsula, right? For example, let's take example of countries like Libya, Syria, and US and Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia has a big partnership in oil with Russia. On the other hand, it has its military support and a lot of its economic support comes from the West, right? The US in particular. Or similarly, when it comes to Libya, right? Which is itself not going through very good times right now. But at the same time, uh, Russia has very big bases in Libya. So those bases could actually become sources of mobilization of army, right? If this actually crisis escalates. Similarly, we have countries like Syria, right, which is very close to Israel, right? So when you talk about this idea of escalation, I believe that this very crisis will not escalate itself because इसके economic impact सब चलो है ही है. When we talked about how wheat exporters हैं, a lot of Middle East region को सबसे ज़्यादा wheat रशिया और यूक्रेन से जाता है, ठीक है. We talked about how there are militarily it does not make sense. We talked about how अब मेरा ये है, we talked about how it does not make sense in diplomatically as well because you said yourself that Ukraine does not want that to happen, or Russia itself also feels threatened by this whole thing, and in the economic sense we also talk about Nord Stream 2. So आखिरी बस मेरा ये है कि how do you in 3 months time आप इस इशू को कहाँ पे देख रहे हैं?
Interesting. Um, I'm actually not sure. मेरे ख्याल से in 3 months time definitely there is not going to be a war. That's what I would like to believe because I think sense will prevail and countries will not go for a war. But it is quite possible that Russia and Ukraine continue to hate each other on this issue, and Ukraine keeps bringing up this issue of joining NATO again and again. But I do think that mediation is what's going to happen eventually. Countries like Turkey that are on good terms with both, countries like France that are also neutral, maybe even Pakistan. I'm not sure how Pakistan deals with Ukraine. I really have no idea. But I think countries that are in the middle are the ones that are going to take charge eventually. And it is quite possible that Ukraine itself is going to tell the US to sort of back off a little because we saw such statements from Zelensky himself. If the domestic pressure rises, if the domestic pressure gets even harder, and the Ukrainian population tells its government or presses its government to not let it turn into a full-blown crisis, then of course Ukraine might tell the US to sort of not create panic, just how they did before. Or I think in 3 months' time, or even 1 month time, or maybe in a couple of days, because Russia likes to say that it's just military exercise and nothing more. So if that turns out to be true and Russian forces go back, so maybe ये issue वहीं पे खत्म हो जाए. But the idea that Ukraine would want to join NATO, this might come up again and again because it is what Ukraine wants at this point. So of course, Russia is going to have to find a better way to deal with it as opposed to simply threatening them with invasion every time, because this is not how it's going to work every time. Of course, countries भी at some point, neighbors भी कहेंगे उनके कि please बस कर दें, आप mediation करा लें, सही वाली एक दफा decide कर लें उनको NATO join करने देनी है या नहीं करने देनी. Or if you're gonna if you're gonna let them join the EU, then just let it happen. If not, then just tell them, you cannot join EU. It's not in our interest, or it's not in your interest. So I don't think बार बार यही वाला issue इसी तरह से raise होगा. I don't think um, Russia and Ukraine are gonna come close to a standoff every time. I think that once these military exercises, or what Russia is calling them, they end, we can have a clearer picture of where these two countries stand. So in my humble opinion, this standoff is going to come to an end, or probably Ukraine is going to drop its demand of joining NATO at this point. So in 3 months, guys, in 3 months' time, the world is most likely going to go back to how it was a month or so ago, without any such crisis.
Yeah.
That's what I hope.
I believe that sanctions are definitely coming from the West on Russia, and
How?
because
How will those
because
sanctions affect the EU countries?
uh,
Let's say
uh,
Russia cannot export gas because of those sanctions, then what will the EU countries do? What will Germany do? Or is Germany just going to sit back and let those sanctions be slapped on Russia? और फिर gas नहीं मिलेगी उनको?
that is the $1 million question, right? Because as of right now, European Union, even Germany, the Olaf, who's the German chancellor, he's actually worked with US, and some sort of sanctions are already being presented, okay? And they're just waiting for the Russian side is actually supposed to make some comments and counteroffer to US about how to end this issue diplomatically in a few hours. But if that does not go in the direction that US seems to want it to, so I believe sanctions might be in play uh, on Russia. But then again, obviously, we have to consider the fact, as you just said, कि इसका impact क्या होगा EU पे, और वो किस किस्म की sanctions होंगी, that remains to be seen. But thank you so much, Ifrah, for this amazing talk. Or we learned a lot today. I learned a lot today. Or
I learned a lot from you.
yeah. So before in every podcast, I ask my guests this last question before they actually leave, which is recommend a book that you would like the readers to actually read, and about any topic, not necessarily IR, any book that you should recommend to the people.
Oh, I'm just reading Hostility these days by Abdul Basit. मैंने काफी months पहले start की थी, but I just got busy with some stuff और मैंने complete नहीं की, तो मैं अब उसको आजकल complete कर रही हूँ. It's a really nice book. It gives you a brilliant perspective on how relationship between India and Pakistan works, and it also gives you a really good perspective on how the previous governments have been in their dealing with India, and how they sort of put their interests before the country's interests. Everybody knows I'm a big PDI fan, so it really annoys me when I read that book about how the prime minister or the foreign office dealt with this whole situation, how they put Kashmir on the back burner just because their own business interests were much more important. And it's not me who's saying it, was the Pakistani High Commissioner in India who was saying that. So as someone who's always looked up to the foreign office, it really annoyed me to see how the foreign office worked, because how unprofessional it can be at times, just because we have this animosity or ego, or this bureaucratic tussle between people. So that book gives you a really good perspective on how things work in Pakistan. It really makes you want to pull your hair out sometimes, because if you could just go back in time and undo a few things, then the Kashmir situation might not have been what it is today. It's a really nice book. If people have not read it up till now, they should give it a go. They should give it a try. You should read it
Yeah,
too if you haven't.
yeah, I'll definitely add it to my reading list. So thank you so much, Ifra. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and watching this episode. Please like, share, and subscribe to Let's Talk Pakistan, and help this podcast grow so that we can bring more amazing content for you in the future. Thank you, and Allah Hafiz.
Hafiz.